Elijah in the cave. Elijah is in a state of depression and running because of Jezebel's oath to kill him. So in 1 Kings 19:3, we read of Elijah running. The last time we had seen him, he was in Jezreel, and he ran what is by direct line 95 miles down to the southern end of Judah. Jezreel was in Israel, and Beersheba was in the southern kingdom, and it was clear down at the south end of the southern kingdom. Left his servant there and went another day's journey, and sat under a broom tree. And he prays for death. Says, I'm not any better than my forefathers. Then an angel ministered to him there. Angels are messengers sent to minister to men. And the messenger gave him what he couldn't supply for himself. He could sleep. He'd tired himself out pretty thoroughly, and he could sleep just fine, thank you, but he hadn't brought himself anything to eat or drink, and so the messenger brought him bread and water. There's some disagreement amongst the commentator as to whether the bread was actually seen cooking on the rock, or if it was just describing bread as something that would have been cooked, baked on the rock. I don't think it makes a lot of difference one way or the other. And then there's a second approach after he slept for a while by the angel, and that takes us to 1 Kings 19 and verse 8. So he arose and ate and drank and went on the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And Elijah took 40 days for what might have been done in a lot less time. So he got somewhat of a leisurely trip after he'd rushed down into the wilderness. Horeb, the mountain of God, is another name for Sinai. When we refer to it, we usually say Mount Sinai. It's where Moses saw the burning bush, and it's where God instructed Israel in the law. And the Lord speaks directly to Elijah on the next slide, 1 Kings 19:9. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? A cave on Mount Horeb. All of our most popular translations render it a cave. But the Hebrew very clearly says the cave. Puts the article in. And in this case, in the Hebrew, it's a hey. It's a one character at the beginning of the word that is the article, the cave. And the Septuagint has the cave. The Septuagint was the translation from Hebrew into Greek that was made before the time of Christ. So at the time of Christ, they had the Septuagint translation. And that translation of this verse speaks of not a cave, but the cave. And so you wonder, what is it? The makes it some specific cave. Perhaps the only cave on Mount Horeb. That's a possibility. Or perhaps the cave that Moses had used, they say, when he was in the cleft in the rock and God placed his hand over him and passed by and allowed him to see his backside. Maybe that was where Moses was. Maybe it's the cave because it's that cave. Horeb was the location of historic events. It was also a place of solitude. It was a long ways away from anything. In the next slide, in Jeremiah 9:2, it says, Oh, that I had in the desert a wayfarer's lodging place, that I might leave my people and go from them, for all of them are adulterers, an assembly of treacherous men. Jeremiah felt the need for a place away from it all. I don't suppose that's a totally strange thought. We might, any of us, like to have a place away from it all. That's kind of like what we get when we go down to the desert. It is desert, but it is a place of solitude, and it's kind of nice. It was a shelter, of course, but it was not a place to which God had directed him. And God is saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" As if to imply, "I didn't send you here. Why are you here?" God sent him to the brook. God sent him to Zarephath. God sent him to see Ahab. God did not send him to Horeb. God did give him food and strength, sent his angel along to help him on the way, so he cooperated. He didn't abandon Elijah in his unhappy frame of mind. I think we can find encouragement in that, don't you? We're not always in the right frame of mind. In case you hadn't noticed, I'll tell you. But God does not abandon us. Isn't that marvelous? God makes Elijah think about his purpose, though. In our next slide, in 1 Kings 19:10, why is Elijah there? Think about your basic purpose, Elijah. He said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel I have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." God is paying attention to where we are. You knew that. God knows everything. But here we have God looking down at Elijah. "Elijah, why are you here? Am I here for convenience? Is that why I'm here? Is that why you're here? Is it convenience? Am I here for pleasure?" Sometimes we're someplace for pleasure. We go down to a theme park, or we go down to the beach, or something like that. Am I here for safety? Does this seem like a safer place than some others? Or am I here because God has sent me? And that seems to be the issue here. Why are you here? I didn't send you here. Elijah explains, "I've been very zealous." And Elijah had been. He had really thrown his heart and soul into doing the thing that God wanted him to do. He'd been very zealous. And the God he serves is the Lord God of hosts. He says, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts." God of hosts is the God who has a lot of different armies. He has a lot of different collections of people, and he is able to use them. And Elijah has taken advantage of some of those hosts of God. God has the hosts of all the natural powers in the world. So the fire that came down from heaven, part of the hosts of God. And he says, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts." And then he says, his countrymen, the sons of Israel, have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. The Mosaic covenant given at Sinai would have been the most significant of the covenants that they've broken. It would be the theme of the Song of Moses, which presumably a lot of them knew. God had designed for that song to be memorized by Israel. It was all about that covenant, but they've forsaken the covenants of God. Turn down your altars. It's interesting that that word altars is plural. Now, by this time, there would be the temple in Jerusalem. And it would have two altars, the brazen altar outside the tent and the golden altar in the holy place in the tent. But perhaps there were other altars. From time to time, they made altars to worship God. They were only supposed to do that at Jerusalem, but it turned out that they built some high places. They were kind of imitating what the worshipers of false gods did. And that was sometimes, I don't know, maybe a matter of convenience, and they'd build an altar in another place, and maybe he's thinking about those being torn down. You remember Elijah had built an altar on Mount Carmel, and that one got torn down. The worshipers of Baal, in their excitement to try to get fire down from heaven, had knocked the stones over from that. You know, they couldn't put a tool to the stones from which they made an altar. There was to be no work of man other than piling of stones involved in the making of an altar. So they wouldn't necessarily be able to find stones that would fit together neatly. That makes it a little less stable. So you can understand how a pile of rocks might get knocked over. They've killed your prophets. And of course that was true. Many prophets had been killed, and that's referenced also in the New Testament. He doesn't mention the 450 prophets of Baal that got killed. He's kind of looking at one side of the story here. Israel's been unfaithful. They have killed your prophets. But the rest of the story is these people said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And fully agreed with killing the 450 prophets of Baal. That would be the more balanced presentation. In other words, he's focusing on what is wrong. Does that ever catch up to us, to just focus on the things that are not going well? Not with Chuck, but with the rest of us. We sometimes have trouble with focusing on the wrong things. There's always plenty of wrong to focus on, isn't there? Things going poorly. Philippians 4:8 reminds us to focus on what? True, honest, right, pure, good report, yes. Those things. I have trouble with that myself. I ended up watching too much news.
Yeah.
And pretty rarely is it good news. I've noticed some of the broadcasts try to end with something heartwarming and nice. But most of it that's led up to that point has been bad news. And some of the things that they think are good news are things I think is bad news. So I'm making an effort once again, renewing that effort to try to put more good news into my mind. We have this recorder that will record television shows so that we can watch them later. And the more I focus on just good news, the fewer things it's recording. It has space to record a whole lot of shows, 1 terabyte of memory. And I think it's 86% empty now. Pretty soon it's going to be empty enough that the whole thing will go away. So, focus on the good things, and Elijah has gotten into a funk because he hasn't been focusing on the good things. Is there a complaint against God here in these things? When he talks about all these problems, that it's the reason why he's down there, does that imply, God, you haven't made things right here? Should God have done more? Did Elijah maybe want another miracle like the one that happened on Mount Carmel? Maybe he wanted fire to come down and get Jezebel.
That solves the problem.
That would help with the problem. Jezebel was a big problem. How do we feel about the conditions in our country? Do we think God ought to do something about it? Okay. And then he says, I alone am left. He's explaining why he's there. I alone am left. There isn't anybody else. He can see what's coming. Jezebel's out to get him. There isn't anybody on his side. He's alone. And he figures about the only place he's going to be safe is in a cave on Mount Horeb. Other prophets had not been spared. They died. And yet there were some prophets that were spared. Obadiah said, I have fed 100 prophets in a cave during the years of famine. Of course, from Elijah's standpoint, that's nice, but it would have been nice had they stood with me. When I went up on Mount Carmel, where were they? I was there alone. And they seek my life, he says. I guess that's implying that I'm here to avoid being killed. He's explaining why he's there. They seek my life. This seems like a place they might not get it. Elijah knows there's still prophets of God. Obadiah had told him about them. And yet Elijah doesn't have much respect or appreciation for the prophets of God who are still there. He feels very much alone. Sometimes it feels a little bit like we're alone. That there aren't too many that are prepared to stand with us. So, the next thing that's going to develop here is some rather spectacular things. 1 Kings 19:11, the next slide. So he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by. And a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, a sound of gentle blowing. 3 mighty displays. A wind that rends the rocks. It's been a little windy around here this week, but it didn't rend the rocks. Commentators usually say about this that it probably blew dirt loose from around the rocks, and the rocks came tumbling down the mountain. And I suppose that could be explained that way. I'm not sure. But whatever it was quite a wind. And then an earthquake. We know something about earthquakes here in California. And I've noticed that an earthquake always gets my attention. Very effective. I mean, they go, oh, God's talking. And then a fire. Our God is a consuming fire. The consuming fire is a very impressive thing. It seems like we're kind of vulnerable here in Fort Bragg. We got a really good fire going out there, and we're blowing our way. We'd think it was pretty good to have some land without trees out on the old Georgia Pacific property, wouldn't we? Give us some place to go to get out of the fire. And I don't know what it was like to have that fire there where he was at Mount Horeb. It might have been kind of life-threatening. You know, you see a big fire like that, and maybe a cave is not a good enough hiding place. So that was something. But God is not in those awesome displays. He is speaking to Elijah. There's a message for Elijah in these impressive things. And yet, God is not communicating by these things. So, he He is probably saying, I can do it any way I want to do it. Am I able to send a wind that'll rend the rock? Yeah, I can do that. But I don't have to do that. I don't have to communicate but that way. Can I send an earthquake? Oh yes, I can do that. But I don't have to do that. Can I send a great fire? Yes, I can do that. But that's not the way I'm communicating either. That seems to be the message in these things. Sometimes we want God to always communicate in mighty ways. Show me the mighty ways, Lord. Show me again. I want to know about that fire that came down Mount Carmel. I'd like it to come down in the region of Jezebel. And I think the message is here, okay, Elijah, we're going to have to do it my way. And this isn't my way right now. My way is going to be what? The still small voice. God has chosen to give us over 1,800 years of relative silence. The first century of the church, there was quite a bit of signs and wonders. And those died away. There have been attempts to produce signs and wonders since that time on many different occasions, but they've all died out and been discredited because it doesn't seem that God was doing it. Same thing's happening around today. Some are impatient for the wonders. We need to let God choose how He wants to communicate. Can He communicate in signs and wonders? He can. His arm's not shortened. He can do that. Does He have the right to choose not to if it suits His purposes better? That's the thing we have to have patience for. If He decides to do it, we're going to know it. But until that time, we're to trust Him. We're to walk by faith. Faith has to do with things that are not seen. The gentle breeze. Kol damama dak. Sound, silence, soft. That's what we have translated here as a gentle breeze. 3 Hebrew words. Hebrew is from right to left. The right-hand word is from the right-hand character to the next to the left to the next to the left. And the right-hand word, kol, is next to the right of the next word, which is reading from right to left. And that's the way Hebrew runs. So if you've got a Hebrew Bible, you turn not here, but here to start the Bible, and you work your way from that back. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what they were translating. There's a word for sound, there's a word for silence, and there's a word for soft. And okay, you can make that a gentle voice. It's a sound that is soft. But the New Revised Standard translates it a sound of sheer silence. Elijah was back in the cave. He probably moved back at the first wind. I mean, if you were standing outside the cave and that kind of a wind came around, you'd probably say, time for me to go back inside. And that's all I need. So I will get rid of that. Thank you very much. I'll try to do better next week. And so it comes to a lull in all this excitement that's going on, and he figures out, okay, it's time for me to go back out again. That's where the Lord told me to go, and so he moves back out. And verse 13, 1 Kings 19:13, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Sounds a little bit like his question before, doesn't it? Whole lot like it. Wrapped his face. He had a sense of he's going into the presence of God, and he knows that's not really a safe place to be sightseeing. So he's protecting himself. And God repeats the question. Verse 14. Then he said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Does that sound like his first answer? Yeah. It's a whole lot like his first answer. Matter of fact, it's exactly his first answer. He hasn't developed. His reason for being there is the same, and we're not going to have any comment on it. God's not going to rebuke him. God's not going to instruct him except to say, "Now here's your next assignment." And what has gone on there is a little interlude in Elijah's life. And he's going to get instructions now. He's going to have some more assignments. They're going to start out with kind of easy to do things. Go talk to this one and go talk to that one. But before long, he's calling fire down from heaven again. So he's restored. Sometimes there's just an interlude in life, and God has patience with our weakness. He considers that we are but dust, and he keeps on using us after that. It's not necessarily the end of the road just because you've had a breakdown. And I think that's the message of this. And this kind of is a marker in the story for me. We're done with Elijah in the cave, and I just wanted to talk in this section about Elijah in the cave. We'll pick it up next time and see some of the other things that God chooses to do in Elijah's life. Comments or questions?